Welcome to another infographic instant with Brian Michael. In this episode, we will be asking how many lawyers will Hong Kong need in order to compete in China? This infographic is from a slightly larger article which appeared in the Hong Kong Lawyer. And in that article, we ask whether Hong Kong law firms should be allowed to list on the local stock exchange. We argue in that paper that Hong Kong is different than the US and the UK, for example, in that Hong Kong had pre-existing distortions which prevented the development of a quote-unquote indigenous legal practice and legal industry. And thus, we argue for a type of limited listing, or rules that provided on a limited basis listing of solicitor firms in Hong Kong, as a way to improve the competitiveness of these law firms and help rectify these supposed pre-existing distortions which have reduced the indigenous law firms' ability to compete with foreign firms that are competing in Hong Kong. Now, turning our attention to the infographic provides a vital chain in our argument, and that argument is that China's demand for legal services will be increasing significantly in the upcoming years. Now, given in order to match this demand, we would expect Hong Kong legal service providers to grow, to scale up in order to address this market, of course competing with mainland firms that are trying to do the same thing. And in order to compete for this growing volume of legal services demand, these Hong Kong firms will require capital in order to scale up, and particularly locally run and created companies will need this capital in order to compete with their much larger, much more savvy global rivals. So, turning our attention now to the infographic, we see that this expected increase in demand on the mainland for legal services has both a level and distribution effect. In other words, we expect to see an increase in the level of demand for legal services, and thus an increase in the number of law firms and the number of attorneys which Hong Kong's law service providers provide. And we also expect to see a change in the distribution of these law firms and these attorneys as local companies would gain access to the same kinds of capital that their foreign rivals have in New York and London. So, turning our attention to the infographic, we show on the left-hand side of this bar chart the number of firms and the number of solicitors currently operating in Hong Kong. And that number of solicitors comes out at a bit more than 2,000 for roughly 747 firms. Now, on the right-hand side of the infographic, we see the estimated demand for legal services, and we see particularly we've estimated the number of attorneys and the number of law firms that would arise in order to service this demand. And as we see in the footnote, the way that we have derived these figures is that we have taken other statistics such as lawyer to GDP ratios, law firm to GDP ratios, and we've just simply extrapolated that onto where Hong Kong is now and where Hong Kong needs to be in order to provide sufficient level of supply in order to match China's expected demand for lawyers and law firms given its population, its GDP, the growth rate of those figures, and other factors. The number of solicitors supplied by Hong Kong legal firms should roughly treble at about 6,000, and we would see an increase up to about 1,580 firms. This has been another infographic instant with Brian Michael.